This is our concluding lesson for Genesis. We'll take a look at some of the themes that we've been following and at the patriarchs. From the very beginning, we noted that there were three things that were the themes throughout the study of Genesis. So just to recapture those again in our memory and to remember them as we go forward in the future. The Creator continued to have a commitment to his creation. God chose Abraham and Sarah to be a blessing to future generations, and Israel was learning to live as God's people in a hostile world. So look at the life cycles of the patriarchs. There are three life cycles of the patriarchs that are the composite for Genesis. There's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So those three main patriarchs, but we also consider Jacob's son Joseph can be considered a transitional patriarch in this cyclical story. So each of these stories carry the whole theme from the learning to live as God's people in a hostile world and bringing blessings to the future generations. When we looked at the first chapters of Genesis 1 through 11, they are narratives that communicated some of the basic beliefs about life and the universe, what the ancient people believed. In chapters 12 through 22, we looked at the Abraham and Sarah stories. And then from 25 through 35, we looked at Jacob, his wives, and family stories. And then in the last part of Genesis, from chapter 35 through 50, we followed through the life story of Joseph. Each narrative started with the early years of the person, building up to some focal points during their middle life, and concluded with some resolutions to problems that came along for their life. In other words, like a story plot with a beginning, middle, and end for each of these patriarchs. To summarize Abraham, in chapter 12 of Genesis, we heard the original call to Abraham from God. In chapter 15, the future was told to Abraham in a dream. In Genesis 17, a name change was given to Abraham and Sarah, from Abram to Abraham and from Sarai to Sarah. And also there was an introduction of a name change for God. He was then known as Elohim. In chapters 16 and 18, there are the descendants and prosperity noted for Abraham and his clan. And in chapter 22, we have the record of his burial in Canaan, where he had earlier purchased property for his wife Sarah to be buried. In Genesis 22, it says of Abraham that he lived for 175 years, and he died at a ripe old age, having lived a long and satisfying life. He breathed his last and joined his ancestors in death. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Milcah near Mamre in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. And this was the same field that Abraham had purchased from the Hittites and where he had buried his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who settled near Beer Lahai Roi in the Negev. And then from we go on to Jacob's story. In Genesis 27, Jacob, we find out his personality. He's quite deceitful. Then he sets up some of the problems that he has with his brother Esau, and he has to flee to Aaron. There are struggles with an angel. Jacob prospers, and he has 4 wives and many children. And in chapter 31, he comes back to Canaan, and Jacob struggles with God, and he also has a name change. We take a look at Jacob. He foretells the future in his final blessings in chapters 48 and 49. He gives the blessings to his sons as he is preparing for his own death. And I'm not going to read through all of those because I think we looked at them in the last lesson. And sort of familiar words here. In chapter 49, Jacob says, as he gives instructions, "Soon I will die and join my ancestors. Bury me with my father and grandfather in the cave in the field of Ephraim the Hittite." And then it gives a description of the same thing, where it is and who it was purchased from. And then on verse 31, it says, "There Abraham and his wife Sarah are buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah are buried. And there I buried Leah. It is the plot of land in the cave that my grandfather Abraham bought from the Hittites." I think that this is a significant event, the burial, but it's also significant because of the place that it is. It is in the land of Canaan that is promised all along for the descendants of Abraham, that they would return to Canaan. So this is a place where they want to be at rest in a land that was to be their own. And it's like the very first piece of property purchased by any of the Israelites in the land of Canaan. Right, then we move on to Joseph's story. In Joseph's story starts in chapter 35, and in 37 we read about his early years at home and how he was a favorite child. Then he departed to Egypt as being sold as a slave to the Arab traders by his brothers. But he was prosperous when he entered Egypt. And in the end, the cycle of his life, his brothers came to him, and he finally identified himself to his brother, and the family was reunited, and he brought his family into Egypt. But here again, in the end of his life, his wish was honored that his bones would be actually buried in Canaan, which was the homeland. And so in Genesis 50, we have a summary, and we'll see that this cave is mentioned again. And so it says on verse 22, "So Joseph and his brothers and their families continued to live in Egypt. Joseph lived to the age of 110. He lived to see 3 generations of descendants of his son Ephraim, and he lived to see the birth of children of Manasseh, his son Machir, whom he claimed as his own." And so there we have the life cycle of Joseph. And the same start where it's the end of his life, and he's going to be telling his family what his final wishes are for his burial. "Soon I will die," Joseph told his brothers, "but God will surely come to help you and lead you out of this land of Egypt. He will bring you back to the land he solemnly promised to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." So his final thoughts and words are shared, that he knows and feels that they will be able to return to their native areas where they camped in throughout the land of Canaan. And then his final wish is that he will be taken there as well. So he made the sons of Israel swear an oath, and he said, when God comes to help you and lead you back, you must take my bones with you. So Joseph died at the age of 110. The Egyptians embalmed him, and his body was placed in a coffin in Egypt. So he was treated as an Egyptian burial more than an Israelite burial, because he was a man of honor within the country of Egypt. All right, so am going to show you this video. It's quite lengthy, but I hope you will enjoy it. It is really a good video because it will help understand how there is migration taking place between Canaan and Egypt and other areas of Mesopotamia as well, back and forth, and with war also that may have brought in different things to change the life of Egypt. And we'll understand a little bit more about Joseph and the way things were in Egypt so that we can make a transition into the book of Exodus. So I hope you enjoy this.
And now the story shifts to Joseph. Just as the narrative up to now has been shaped by the culture of Syria Canaan, the story of Joseph is developed in the context of an entirely different culture, the great civilization of ancient Egypt. A polytheistic culture, of course, just like the culture of Mesopotamia, but still a major political and cultural power at this point in the story. As we saw in the previous lecture, trying to place the stories of the Bible in a particular historical framework is always a difficult task. Why? Well, not until the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel do we actually have historical evidence of when these people lived. Also, we should always remember that the stories of the Torah, the first division of Hebrew scripture, are a combination of several different narrative traditions. So identifying a particular period, or even the reign of a king, is very difficult. But when we get to Joseph, it is, I think, very feasible to place that story in a unique moment of Egypt's history. That moment, I think, is at the end of the Middle Kingdom, during a period that scholars refer to as the Second Intermediate Period. Let's take a look. During the Middle Kingdom period, which began around 2040 BC and ended 400 years later, the central authority of Pharaoh began to crumble. The same was true for the borders of the kingdom itself. The result was a wave of immigration from the east, with refugees from Canaan, Syria, and Anatolia, who were all attracted by rumors of Egypt's wealth and prosperity. Since Egypt's kings were powerless to stop them, these immigrants were free to settle in the fertile Nile Delta as they saw fit. In time, they began to dominate the cultivation and governance of the region, gradually replacing Egyptian control. The Egyptian historian Manetho calls these Semitic chieftains the Hyksos, or Hykau Kozwet, which means desert princes. In response, the Egyptian nobility was forced to move southward to Thebes and establish the 17th dynasty. Here they would set up a court in exile and plot their eventual return to the north. So by the beginning of this second intermediate period, around 1640 BC, migrants from Anatolia, Syria, and most importantly from Canaan had taken control of Lower Egypt, and from there they controlled the Nile Delta. And so I think it's quite plausible to think that the story of Joseph in Egypt is set in this time period. How did this young man get to Egypt? Well, as Genesis tells us, all was not well with Jacob's clan. After Rachel's death near Bethlehem, Jacob began to lavish attention on Joseph, his son by his beloved wife. Joseph's brothers, including the sons of the unloved wife Leah, didn't like that at all. They were deeply put out when Jacob gave Joseph a beautiful coat, which, with all due respect to Andrew Lloyd Webber, has often been mistranslated as a coat of many colors. And in fact, the Hebrew word pasim does not mean multicolored stripes, but a garment of strips. And that implies that Joseph's coat was long-sleeved, cut from the finest strips of cloth. Now, that was a very special cut indeed, certainly for a shepherd boy. In the end, the brothers decide to get rid of Joseph. They set the stage by taking their flocks far up north, away from the home fields in Shechem. Of course, eventually Jacob became worried and asked Joseph to go and see where they were. And Joseph found them near the town of Dothan, located some 65 miles north of Hebron. As it happened, Dothan was located right on one of the main trade routes from Syria to Egypt, a caravan of Ishmaelites. And here Genesis uses the term to indicate Arab traders as descendants of Ishmael was just passing by, and so the brothers decided to sell Joseph as a slave. The deal was done for 20 pieces of silver, which, as we know, was actually the going rate for a healthy male slave in the Bronze Age. Genesis tells us that Joseph was taken from Dothan to Egypt, a distance of over 300 miles. Such traders would have used the route that ran along the Mediterranean coast and eventually became known as the Way of the Philistines. Even then, it was still dangerous. In 1270 BC, a high official of one of Egypt's mines reported that only half of the caravans arrived safely, for they die of thirst on the road. Genesis claims that they rode camels, but that is probably the imagination of the scribes who compiled the final version of the Torah in the 6th or 5th century BC. At that time, they would have still used donkeys. In the meantime, Joseph made it to Egypt, where he was put to work in the household of Potiphar, a captain of Pharaoh's guard. In other words, he was now in the capital city, close to the palace of the king. And if that's true, Joseph would not have raised any eyebrows. As we saw, this was a period of intense immigration from the east, including Canaan. For example, we have an 18th century inventory of an upper-class household from Thebes, which lists 80 servants, including cooks, weavers, a brewer, and a tutor. Half of these are clearly Semites, with such names as Aqaba and even Menachem. Genesis tells us that Joseph soon impressed everyone with his diligence and loyalty. There was only one problem, and that was that Potiphar's wife was bored. Perhaps her husband neglected her. As we can imagine, serving as the captain of the royal guard is a demanding job. And so it wasn't long before the wife began to take an interest in this handsome young lad from Canaan. Now, Genesis does not give us her name, but the Quran which, by the way, has wonderful stories about her and Joseph, does. Her name, according to the Quran, is Zuleika, a wonderfully exotic and sensuous name. One day, she tried to get Joseph into bed, but Joseph, the righteous young man that he was, refused. Of course, that made her mad, but it also made her worried that Joseph might tell her husband about the failed attempt at seduction. And so she decided on a preemptive strike. When Potiphar came home, she told him that Joseph had tried to rape her. As we saw earlier, Genesis likes to use literary motifs from the culture in which its stories are set. That's also the case here. In fact, the story of Joseph and Zuleika is very similar to an old Egyptian fable known as the Tale of Two Brothers. It goes something like this. There was a man named Bata who lived with his older brother Anubis and his wife. One day, when they were working in the fields, Anubis told Bata to go home and get some more seeds. But when Bata arrived at the house, his brother's wife was all over him. "Come," she said, "let's spend an hour lying together. It will be good for you." Bata was shocked and ran off. And of course, now the wife began to worry that he might tell his brother about what had happened. So when Anubis came home, he found his wife with her clothes all torn up, weeping and crying that Bata had tried to force himself on her. Of course, Bata said it was all a lie. But who was Anubis going to believe? His wife, of course. And the same thing happened with Potiphar's wife. It was her word against Joseph's. And of course, the wife prevailed. Joseph was arrested and thrown in prison. But while there, he began to make a name for himself by interpreting dreams. Now, we may find that strange, but once again, Genesis is using a core motif of Egyptian culture. Dreams in ancient Egypt were big business. There were hundreds of dream books that claimed to know the meaning of sleep-induced visions, whether these foretold good fortune or disaster. Some people even went to sleep in the temple of their favorite god in the hope that this deity would reveal an answer to their questions. Kings, too, were very keen on interpreting their dreams. During the Middle Kingdom, King Ketai even commissioned a book for his son, The Teaching for King Merikara, which warns that dreams often mean the exact opposite of what they seem. And so it's very plausible what Genesis is telling us next, namely that the king himself is having a dream, a really weird one, and no one can tell him what it means. Fortunately, someone remembers that Joseph is a very skillful dream whisperer, and so the young man is summoned from prison and brought to the court of Pharaoh. And the king tells him his dream. He says, "There came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up, and they ate the 7 sleek and fat cows." What on earth does that mean? All the royal counselors are stumped, but Joseph has the answer. The 7 good cows, he says, are 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, there will come 7 years of famine. That's silence. 7 years of famine? No dynasty could ever survive that. As Egypt's history shows, whenever the harvest failed for 1 or more years in a row, that always led to great political upheaval. No doubt, Pharaoh would lose his throne. So what should he do? What could anyone do? And here, Joseph has an answer as well. Let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, he says, and set him over the land of Egypt. Then let them gather all the food of the good years that are coming, and store them for when the times are bad. Brilliant solution. Pharaoh is deeply impressed. He ponders the young man in front of him and says, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only I be greater than you." And so the slave from Canaan, the shepherd boy from Bethel, becomes the grand vizier, the prime minister of Egypt. Historians have scoffed at that idea. It's a wonderful legend, they say, but look, there is no evidence that any such grand vizier ever existed. That's true. But now let's look at the historical context. As we saw, during the Second Intermediate Period, it was the Hyksos, immigrants from Syria and Canaan, who had taken control of the Nile Delta. Their kings styled themselves after the pharaohs of the old regime, assuming their dress, their titles, their customs. They even built a capital in Avaris, which was excavated by the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak. Among these kings is even a pharaoh called Yakub Her. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this individual is the same as Jacob in the Bible, but it does show that during this period, it was Semites who ruled the land instead of the Egyptian nobility up north. So the idea that an immigrant from Canaan could rise to the post of Grand Vizier of Egypt is quite plausible when we remember that all other officials at the Hyksos court would have been immigrants from that same region as well. There are other tantalizing clues for this hypothesis. The use of 7 years as a unit of time is also found in several Egyptian texts, including the Book of the Dead. And Genesis says that during the ceremony of Joseph's investiture, Pharaoh put a gold chain around his neck. That is accurate. High officials in Egypt typically wore such a chain of office, and several samples have actually survived, including a beautiful color in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And finally, since Joseph needs to travel all across the land to supervise the storing of grain, Pharaoh gives Joseph his own company car in the form of a chariot, right? But here is the clincher. Before this period, the Second Intermediate Period, the Egyptians didn't have chariots. The chariot with the spoked wheels pulled by 2 fast horses was introduced by the Hyksos. So at the very least, the chariot reference suggests that the story of Joseph and the period of the Hyksos in Egypt are closely intertwined. And then after 7 years, the famine did come. Once again, people from across Canaan streamed to Egypt in the hopes of buying grain. Jacob's sons were among them. After several tests, Joseph reveals himself. The brothers embrace, and the clan of Jacob moves to the Nile Delta, to the land of Goshen, where they will live for generations to come. And so ends the story of Joseph. In our next lecture, we will fast forward 400 years to a time when Pharaoh no longer recognized Joseph or the decree by which his people were allowed to settle in the fields of the Delta.
All right, I hope that that would have broadened your view of what might have happened during the time of Joseph and his brothers, and how Canaan and Egypt were always intertwined in economic partnership. So generally, overview here, the theme of goodness in Genesis comes full circle. In Genesis 1, God created everything very good, it said. And throughout Genesis, God has been pursuing these good intentions for the created order. God recruited human beings to participate in that pursuit of goodness. God's creative work leads to specific vocations to bring about goodness. God's creational purpose for goodness, life, and well-being in and through people do not cease. It does not cease, even in the face of weakness or failures. God has been active among both the chosen and the unchosen, including the Egyptians and other non-Israelites, with exactly the same purpose in mind, life. Genesis attests to God's universal purpose in the story of Israel. The people of God can trust that in the midst of sin and evil, God pursues his purposes for good. God brings unity to this story. God is the one who has been active in the story with a constant good purpose from the beginning to the end, that there might be life for all. God is the only one who has been active at every level of the story, from the highest tiers of governmental authority to the lowest sphere of everyday family life, pervading over them with a divine purpose for good. God holds life together in all of its personal and social complexity and ambiguity. And so we conclude our study of Genesis. And we're going to go on break until the new year. So here is some suggested reading that I have for you. It's quite lengthy, and I know it's a busy time of the year, but we can give it a try anyway. To read the entire book of Genesis with a new awareness of all the things that we have learned now, I think, looking back on it, and be aware that it was written for an ancient audience. And I think that we'll be able to see the themes of goodness throughout the book of Genesis. We can look at it from a different point of view now that we know a lot more of the background from the lessons that we've had. And then another option for December is that you could read the book of Luke starting on December 1st with chapter 1. If you read one chapter each day, that equals 24 days until Christmas, and you will have read the story of the Annunciation and the birth of Jesus. Happy holidays, be safe, enjoy your family and friends, and I will see you back for class on January 4th. Here's our schedule.